Stand on the high plains of the Texas Panhandle today, and you will find nothing but grass moving in the wind. No herds darken the horizon, no hide camps smoke along the rivers. A century and a half ago, this very emptiness was America's greatest killing ground, and the instrument of it was a rifle stamped with one name, Sharps. Built in Hartford, perfected for a single perfect shot, it armed sharpshooters, hunters, and the men who emptied a continent. The story of the Sharps rifle begins with a man who understood a simple, terrible truth about the weapons of his age. A soldier or a hunter fired once, and then he was nearly defenseless. The muzzle-loading musket and rifle that armed America in the first half of the 19th century demanded a ritual that had not changed in 200 years. Pour powder down the barrel, seat a ball, and patch. Ram it home. Prime the pan or fit a cap. Cock, aim, fire. A skilled man managed 3 rounds a minute under perfect conditions. In rain, in panic, in the chaos of a charging enemy or a stampeding herd, he managed far fewer. Men died in the seconds between shots, fumbling with ramrods while danger closed the distance. Christian Sharps had grown up inside this problem. He was born on January 2, 1810, in Washington, New Jersey, and as a young man he apprenticed at the Harper's Ferry Armory in Virginia. There he worked under Captain John Hall, the inventor who had spent 2 decades on an island in the Shenandoah River, proving that a rifle could be loaded from the breech instead of the muzzle, and that its parts could be made interchangeable. Hall's breech loaders leaked gas, fouled quickly, and never fully won the Army's trust, but the principle lodged itself in the mind of his young apprentice. Sharps absorbed both the promise and the failure. He understood what breech loading could be, and he understood precisely why every previous attempt had fallen short. What stopped the breech loader was the seal. When a rifle fired, the explosion had to drive the ball forward, not backward, into the shooter's face. A muzzle loader sealed itself because the charge sat at the bottom of a closed tube. A breech loader opened at the rear, and that opening was a weakness. Hot gas escaped through any gap between the breech block and the barrel. The escaping gas robbed the ball of power, fouled the mechanism, and burned the man holding the gun. Every inventor who tried to load from the rear collided with the same wall. Theory promised a faster weapon. Practice delivered a leaking, dangerous one. Sharps solved it with a sliding block. His mechanism used a heavy steel breech block that dropped down when the operator worked a lever beneath the rifle, exposing the chamber. The shooter inserted a paper or linen cartridge, then raised the lever, and the block slid up to seal the breech. Here was the elegant part. As the block rose, a sharpened edge sheared off the rear of the paper cartridge, exposing the powder to the ignition. When the rifle fired, pressure helped force the block tight against the barrel, sealing the gas at the moment the seal mattered most. The harder it fired, the tighter it held. Sharps had turned the breech loader's central weakness into the source of its strength. He patented the design on September 12, 1848. United States Patent number 5763 described a falling block breech-loading mechanism strong enough to handle the pressures of military powder, simple enough to manufacture, and reliable enough that a man could trust it in the field. This was the breakthrough that decades of gun makers had chased and missed. What Sharps had invented was not merely a clever gun. It was a manufacturable principle, a thing that could be built in quantity and depended upon in combat. Here's the thing about Christian Sharps. He was a brilliant inventor and a poor businessman, and the gap between those two facts would shape everything that followed. He had the patent. He did not have a factory, capital, or the temperament to build either. In 1850, he moved to Mill Creek, Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia, and contracted with the firm of A.S. Nippes to manufacture his first sporting rifles, the models that would come to be known as the 1849 and 1850. The guns worked. The business did not generate the money or the scale his invention deserved. Sharps was an idea man stranded without the machinery to multiply his idea. The solution arrived in the form of investors who saw what Sharps could not build alone. In 1851, he relocated to Hartford, Connecticut, and the Sharps Rifle Manufacturing Company was organized as a holding company on October 9th of that year. The arrangement reveals exactly where Sharps stood. He was named engineer and would receive a royalty of $1 for every firearm produced. John C. Palmer was installed as president. Richard S. Lawrence, a gifted machinist from Vermont, came on as master armorer and superintendent of manufacturing. The controlling interest belonged to the investors. The man whose name was stamped on every rifle owned only a sliver of the enterprise that bore it. This was the fatal seed, though no one could see it yet. The company had a revolutionary product, skilled management in Lawrence, and the capital to grow. What it did not have was its inventor in command. Sharps remained more craftsman than industrialist, prickly and independent, and his relationship with the company was rocky from the start. By 1853, he had severed his connection with the firm that carried his name. There is no evidence he ever held any further association with it. The rifle would go on to fame and infamy without him. The man became a footnote to his own invention. Lacking its own production facilities at first, the company contracted with the Windsor, Vermont firm of Robbins and Lawrence to manufacture the new breech loaders, an arrangement that ran until 1855. The early output included the Model 1851 box-lock carbine, which incorporated the Maynard tape primer system, a roll of paper caps that fed automatically with each cock of the hammer. Production was modest. The first government contract called for 10,000 carbines, though only a fraction of that number actually emerged from the Windsor shops. The Sharps was still proving itself, still a curiosity, to a military establishment wedded to the muzzle-loading musket it would keep issuing for years to come. But word of the rifle spread among men who cared less about official doctrine and more about results. The Sharps could be loaded lying down behind cover on horseback. It could be fired and reloaded at a speed no muzzle loader could approach. And it was accurate. The reputation that would carry the weapon into legend was already forming on the frontier and in the shooting matches of the era. The Sharps was the rifle for the man who needed his second shot to come fast and land true. Picture this: a weapon that solved the oldest problem in firearms, built in a quiet Connecticut factory, owned by men whose names history forgot, designed by a man who walked away from it before it made anyone rich. The Sharps rifle was a triumph of engineering wrapped in a failure of proprietorship. It was about to find its first real use, not on a battlefield between armies, but in a vicious border war over the future of slavery, where it would acquire a nickname drawn from scripture and a reputation soaked in blood. The Sharps rifle found its first war not between nations but between neighbors on the prairies of Kansas Territory in the middle of the 1850s. When Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, it left the question of slavery to the settlers themselves, to be decided by popular vote. The result was a race. Pro-slavery men poured in from Missouri. Anti-slavery free soil settlers came down from the north, many of them organized and funded by abolitionist societies in New England. Both sides understood that the territory's future would be settled not only at the ballot box, but with rifles. The land filled with armed men who hated one another, and the killing began. The abolitionists needed weapons, and they knew which weapon they wanted. The Sharps rifle, with its speed and accuracy, gave a defending settler an enormous advantage over an attacker armed with a muzzle loader. Eastern supporters raised money to ship the rifles west, to move them past hostile Missouri towns and the men who watched the river crossings. The guns were packed into wooden crates and labeled as something no one would question. They were marked as Bibles. Roughly 900 Sharps rifles traveled into Kansas in these crates, and the nickname stuck with a grim irony that the era appreciated. Men called them Beecher's Bibles, after Henry Ward Beecher, the famous Brooklyn preacher who had declared that for certain people a Sharps rifle was a greater moral argument than the Scripture itself. Let that sink in. The most advanced firearm in America entered its first conflict disguised as the Word of God, carried by men who believed they were doing God's work with it. The Sharps was no longer just a machine. It had become a symbol, freighted with conviction, stained with the violence of a cause. The rifle that solved an engineering problem had been adopted by a moral war, and it would carry that double identity for the rest of its existence. It was a tool of precision and a tool of righteousness, and the men who held it rarely distinguished between the two. One of those men was John Brown, the fiery abolitionist who had hacked pro-slavery settlers to death along Pottawatomie Creek, understood the Sharps the way a zealot understands a sacred object. When he turned from Kansas to his larger dream of igniting a slave uprising across the South, he carried Sharps rifles with him. In 1859, when Brown launched his doomed raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, the same armory where Christian Sharps had once apprenticed, he brought roughly 300 Sharps carbines, model 1853, intending to arm the enslaved people he expected to rise up and join him. The rifle had traveled a full circle, from the workbenches of Harper's Ferry to the hands of the man who tried to seize it. Brown's raid failed in 36 hours. The uprising never came. He was captured, tried, and hanged. But the Sharps rifles he carried entered the national imagination alongside him, fixing the weapon ever more firmly in the public mind as the gun of the radical, the abolitionist, the man willing to kill and die for his cause. Southern newspapers raged about the Northern rifles found in Brown's possession. The Sharps had become a political object, feared in one half of the country and celebrated in the other. Here's the thing about the rifle's early fame. It was built on the very quality that would one day destroy it. The Sharps was prized because each shot was deliberate, aimed, and lethal, at distances that astonished men accustomed to the smoothbore musket. It was a marksman's weapon, a tool for the patient hand and the steady eye. In a border war fought by individuals and small bands where a single, accurate rifleman behind a wall could hold off a dozen attackers, this was everything. The Sharps owned the world of the precise single shot, but the world was already beginning to turn toward a different idea. Even as the Sharps proved itself in Kansas, other inventors were chasing a rival dream. Not the perfect single shot, but the rapid succession of many shots. The repeating rifle, fed from a magazine, was still crude and underpowered in the 1850s. Its cartridges were weak. Its mechanisms were fragile. No serious soldier or hunter would trust one for stopping power at range. The Sharps remained supreme, precisely because volume could not yet compete with precision. The thing that made the Sharps magnificent was its specialization, and specialization is a wager that the world will keep wanting the same thing. That wager held for now. As the 1850s closed and the nation slid toward open war, the Sharps stood at the height of its early reputation, the finest breech-loading rifle in America, proven in the bloodiest internal conflict the country had yet seen. The company in Hartford had weathered its founder's departure and settled into steady production under Richard Lawrence's skilled management. Orders were growing. The military, so long indifferent, was beginning to pay attention as the prospect of a far larger war loomed over the horizon. Picture this. A rifle that began as a solution to a mechanical puzzle had become, within a decade, the chosen instrument of a national crisis. It had a nickname from the pulpit and a place in the story of the man whose execution helped push the country into civil war. It armed the radicals who wanted slavery destroyed, and it terrified the men who wanted it preserved. The Sharps was no longer a product. It was a participant in history, and the largest test was coming. When the Southern states seceded and the guns opened on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the United States would need rifles by the hundreds of thousands. The Army that had ignored the Sharps for a decade would suddenly become its greatest customer. The weapon that had armed a border war was about to arm a continent's worth of soldiers, and in the hands of one particular regiment of hand-picked marksmen, it would earn a reputation for lethal precision that no other rifle of the war could match. The breech that Christian Sharps had perfected was about to meet the bloodiest conflict in American history. When the Civil War came, the United States Army discovered what the abolitionists of Kansas had known for years. The Sharps rifle was the finest breech loader in America, and a nation suddenly desperate for weapons could no longer afford to ignore it. The Army that had issued muzzle-loading muskets for a decade, that would keep issuing them to most of its infantry throughout the war, now placed orders with the Hartford factory in numbers Christian Sharps could never have imagined when he walked away from his own company. By the war's end, the Union had purchased roughly 100,000 Sharps rifles and carbines. The weapon had finally arrived. The carbine became the favorite of the cavalry. Shorter and lighter than the full rifle, it could be loaded and fired from horseback, a feat nearly impossible with a muzzle loader. A trooper could drop a paper cartridge into the breech, raise the lever, and fire again, while a man with a muzzle-loading carbine was still fumbling for his ramrod. Across the cavalry engagements of the war, the Sharps gave Union horsemen a rate of fire that multiplied their effective strength. It was reliable, it was fast, and it earned the trust of the men who carried it into the worst places in America. But the rifle's true legend in the war belonged to a single regiment of hand-picked men. In 1861, Colonel Hiram Burden, reputed to be among the finest marksmen in the country, raised a unit unlike any other in the Union Army. The men of the 1st United States sharpshooters had to pass a brutal qualifying test. A recruit was required to place 10 consecutive shots into a target at 200 yards, and the shots had to fall within a tight cluster, each one close to the center. Only men who could shoot with extraordinary precision were admitted. Burden wanted the best, and he got them. Burden wanted the best rifle for them too, and after some dispute he secured the Sharps. The choice transformed his sharpshooters into the most feared infantry in the Army. Picture this: a Confederate artillery crew working their cannon a quarter-mile from the Union line suddenly begins to fall, one gunner after another, struck by aimed fire from somewhere they cannot see. No volley, no smoke cloud from a line of muskets, just single, deliberate shots, each one finding a man. The sharpshooters in their distinctive green coats could deliver killing fire at ranges where ordinary infantry could do nothing but wait, and they could sustain that fire faster than any muzzle-loading regiment alive. The result spoke in numbers that seemed impossible. Burden's regiments, armed with Sharps rifles, repeatedly engaged and defeated enemy forces several times their size. The combination of accuracy and rapid fire let a relatively small body of marksmen pin down, harass, and break formations far larger than themselves. They picked off officers, silenced artillery, and screened the movements of the larger army. At Gettysburg, in the fighting around the Devil's Den, and along the approaches to Little Round Top, Burden's men used their Sharps rifles to delay and disrupt Confederate advances, buying time measured in minutes that proved decisive. The rifle did not win the war, but where it appeared in skilled hands, it tilted the local arithmetic of battle. Here's the thing about what the Sharps did in those years. It proved, on the largest possible stage, that the breech loader was not a curiosity, but the future. Every officer who watched a sharpshooter drop a man at 400 yards, every cavalryman who fired 3 rounds in the time an enemy fired 1, absorbed the same lesson. The muzzle loader was finished. The age of loading from the rear had arrived, and there was no going back. The Sharps had been the proof of concept for a revolution in how men would fight. And yet the same war that crowned the Sharps also revealed the shadow that would eventually fall across it. For all its excellence, Sestri was alle Brabi Axoins, the Sharps was still a single-shot weapon. Late in the war, Union cavalry began receiving the Spencer repeating carbine, a rifle that held 7 metallic cartridges in a tube and could fire them in rapid succession. Confederate soldiers who faced Spencer armed troopers complained that the Yankees could load on Sunday and fire all week. The repeater was here. It was still less powerful and less accurate at long range than the Sharps, but the direction of history was now visible to anyone paying attention. Volume was coming for precision. For the moment, though, the Sharps stood at a peak of military prestige. It had armed the elite of the Union Army and proven itself in the largest battles of the war. The Hartford factory had run at full capacity, its machines turning out the weapons that equipped the sharpshooters and the cavalry. The company that had survived its founder's departure now stood as one of the most respected gun makers in the nation, its name synonymous with accuracy and reach. When the war ended in 1865, the Sharps Company faced the question every wartime manufacturer faced. The enormous government contracts evaporated almost overnight. A nation that had consumed rifles by the 100,000 no longer needed them. Hundreds of thousands of surplus weapons flooded the market, driving down prices and strangling demand for new production. The arms makers who had grown fat on war now had to find a peacetime reason to exist, and many of them would not survive the transition. The Sharps Company began searching for that reason. The metallic cartridge, which had powered the Spencer repeater, was maturing rapidly, and it offered the old paper cartridge Sharps a path forward. Many of the Civil War rifles and carbines were converted to fire the new self-contained metallic rounds, extending their service life and keeping the company's product relevant in a changing market. The conversion work bought time. But time was not a strategy, and the leadership in Hartford knew it. The Sharps needed a new frontier, a new customer, a new purpose worthy of the precision built into its mechanism. That purpose was waiting on the Great Plains, where a vast biological treasure still roamed in numbers almost beyond counting, and where a market was forming that would consume rifles and ammunition in staggering quantities. The Sharps had armed a moral war and a civil war. Its next war would be waged not against men, but against an animal, and against the people whose entire world depended on that animal. The rifle that had proven the future of warfare was about to become the most efficient hunting instrument the world had ever seen. The rifle that would define the buffalo era was born, fittingly, from a moment of corporate near-death. In the early 1870s, after the deaths of Master Armorer Richard Lawrence and of Christian Sharps himself, the original firm faltered and very nearly closed its doors, right on the eve of the greatest commercial opportunity in its history. A group of investors stepped in, reorganized the enterprise as the Sharps Rifle Company, and launched a new product that would carry the name to its highest fame. It was the Model 1874, and the company stamped a proud phrase into its barrels. They called it Old Reliable. The Model 1874 was a single-shot falling block rifle in the direct lineage of everything Sharps had built, but adapted for the new age of powerful metallic cartridges, and it was offered in calibers that dwarfed anything from the war years. The hunters who would carry it wanted one thing above all. They wanted a heavy bullet that could drop a 1-ton animal at extreme range with a single shot. The Sharps delivered. Chambered in massive rounds like the .50-90 and the .45 caliber variants, throwing lead slugs of enormous weight behind heavy charges of black powder, The Model 1874 became the most powerful and accurate long-range hunting rifle in the world. The men on the plains gave the largest of these a name that entered American folklore. They called it the Big 50. The term was never an official designation, just the colloquial name for the heaviest Sharps chamberings, the guns that hit hardest and reached farthest. A Big 50 could kill a bison at distances where the animal never heard the report until the bullet had already arrived. The rifle was heavy, often weighing 12 pounds or more, with a long octagonal barrel and set triggers tuned for precision. A skilled hunter could lie prone behind a rest, pick out individual animals at 4, 5, even 600 yards, and drop them one after another. This precision served a particular method of killing. The professional hide hunters did not chase the herds. They practiced what they called the stand. A hunter would settle into a concealed position downwind of a grazing herd, several hundred yards off, and begin shooting the animals at the edges first, dropping them quietly so the others did not bolt. A bison would fall, and the rest of the herd, dulled to the distant crack of the rifle, would continue grazing around the bodies of their fallen. A single hunter on a good stand could kill dozens, sometimes more than 100 animals, without moving from his spot. The Sharps was the perfect instrument for this slaughter, precisely because it was so accurate and so powerful at range. Its greatest virtue had found its darkest application. Here's the thing about why this killing exploded into an industry. It was not sport. It was economics, driven by demand a continent away. In the early 1870s, tanneries in the eastern United States and in Europe developed new processes for turning bison hides into commercial leather, suitable for the belts that drove the machinery of the industrial age. Suddenly, a bison hide was worth real money. A few dollars at the railhead, and a few dollars multiplied across millions of animals was a fortune waiting on the plains. The transcontinental and regional railroads, pushing across the buffalo country, provided the means to ship hides east in bulk. Demand, supply, and transport locked together into a machine of extraction. The machine ran on Sharps rifles. A professional hunter equipped himself with one or more of the heavy Sharps guns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, reloading equipment to recharge his cartridges in camp, and a crew of skinners to strip the hides from the carcasses he left behind. The towns of the frontier filled with the trade. Dodge City, Kansas, became a great clearinghouse for hides, its streets stacked with them, its economy humming with the money of the hunt. Billy Dixon, who would later become famous for reasons beyond hunting, recalled that one good hunter could keep 10 skinners busy, and estimated that some 75,000 buffalo were killed within 60 or 75 miles of Dodge City in a single season. The numbers climbed into a register that strains comprehension. Hunters spoke casually of killing 100 animals in a day, of a single season's take running into the thousands for one man and his crew. Across the southern plains, the combined effort of hundreds of hunters with their Sharps rifles was killing bison faster than any natural force ever had. The animals that had numbered in the tens of millions, that had darkened the prairies in herds stretching to the horizon, were being converted into stacked hides and rotting meat with industrial efficiency. And the rifle that made it possible was celebrated for exactly this capability. Manufacturers and hunters alike praised the Sharps as the finest buffalo gun ever made. Let that sink in. The same qualities that had made the Sharps a noble weapon in the hands of a sharpshooter, the precision, the range, the lethal certainty of a single-aimed shot, now made it the most efficient engine of animal destruction the world had ever seen. There was no contradiction in the machine itself. A rifle does not know what it kills. The Sharps performed its function flawlessly, whether the target was a Confederate gunner or a grazing cow bison. And it was this very flawlessness, this perfection of the single deadly shot, that the hide men prized above all. Picture this: A summer morning on the high plains in the early 1870s. A hunter lies behind a low rise, his big 50 resting across a forked stick, a row of cartridges lined up in the grass beside him. 300 yards off, a herd grazes in the early light, unaware. He breathes, settles the front sight on an animal at the edge, and squeezes the set trigger. The heavy rifle roars and bucks. A bison staggers and falls. The others lift their heads, then return to grazing. He works the lever, ejects the spent case, slides in a fresh round, and chooses his next target. The bodies accumulate through the morning. By the time he rises, stiff and powder-stained, the prairie behind him is dotted with the dead. This was the golden engine of the Sharps Rifle Company, the application that made its name a legend across the West. The orders flowed in. The factory ran. The hunters swore by Old Reliable and would carry it nowhere without spares and ammunition by the case. But the slaughter on the plains was not only an economic phenomenon, it was about to become something colder and more deliberate, a campaign with a purpose far beyond hides and leather. For the vast herds were not merely a resource, they were the foundation of an entire civilization, and there were men in the United States government who understood exactly what would happen to that civilization when the herds were gone. To understand the scale of what happened on the plains in the 1870s, you have to abandon the language of hunting altogether. This was not hunting. It was extraction on an industrial scale, an assembly line laid across 1,000 miles of grassland, and its product was hides, and its waste was almost everything else. The bison that had numbered perhaps 30 million at mid-century, that had been the largest concentration of large mammals on the face of the earth, were reduced in little more than a decade to a few scattered hundreds. It was one of the swiftest annihilations of a species in recorded history, and it was carried out one aimed shot at a time. The arithmetic of the slaughter was monstrous. A single hide hunter, working a good stand with his sharps, might kill 50, 80, 100 animals in a day. Multiply that by a crew working through a season, then by hundreds of crews spread across Kansas, the Texas Panhandle, and the territories, and the totals climb into the millions per year at the peak. The railroads carried the evidence eastward in an endless stream. Whole trains loaded with hides rolled toward the tanneries, and behind the hide trade came a second, grislier industry, for the bones of the millions of animals left to rot on the prairie were later gathered and shipped east by the trainload to be ground into fertilizer and processed into bone char. The plains were harvested twice, first for skin, then for skeleton. What the hunters left behind defied description. A hunter took the hide and sometimes the tongue, a delicacy that sold well, and abandoned the rest. The carcasses lay where they fell, hundreds of them, across a single morning's stand, thousands across a season's range. In the summer heat, they bloated and burst and stank for miles. In the following years, the bleached white bones lay so thick across parts of the prairie that travelers described the ground as paved with them, a vast ossuary stretching to the horizon, where living herds had grazed a few seasons before. The smell of rotting bison hung over the hunting grounds, and the men who worked there grew so used to it that the era gave them a name. They were called stinkers. Here's the thing about the slaughter that the hide economics alone cannot explain. The destruction of the bison aligned with the strategic aims of the United States in its long war against the Plains tribes, and many in the Army and the government understood this clearly. The bison was not merely an animal to the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, and the other peoples of the plains. It was the foundation of their entire existence. It gave them food, clothing, shelter from its hides, tools from its bones, fuel from its dung, and the spiritual center of their way of life. Destroy the herds, and you destroyed the independence of the people who depended on them. You forced them onto reservations, onto government rations, into surrender. The connection was understood at the time, spoken aloud by officers and officials who saw the hide hunters as allies in a campaign of conquest. The result was a convergence of motives that doomed the herds with terrible speed. The hunters killed for profit. The railroads shipped for profit. The tanneries bought for profit. And behind the commercial machine stood a strategic logic that welcomed the destruction, because every dead bison brought the subjugation of the Plains tribes one animal closer. Commerce and conquest pulled in the same direction, and the Sharps rifle served both with the same flawless efficiency. The weapon did not distinguish between a hunter chasing leather money and a policy aimed at starving a people into submission. It simply did what it had always done. It delivered the precise, powerful, long-range shot again and again until there was almost nothing left to shoot. The pace of it stunned even the men carrying it out. The southern herd, which ranged across Kansas, the Indian Territory, and Texas, was effectively destroyed in the span of a few short years in the early to middle 1870s. Hunters who arrived to find the prairie black with animals returned a season or two later to find empty grass and bleaching bones. The thing they hunted was vanishing beneath their own rifles, and still they pressed on, deeper into the remaining range, into the Texas Panhandle and beyond, chasing the last great concentrations of the animal that had seemed inexhaustible only a few years before. And it was this pursuit, this push into the last good buffalo country of the southern plains, that brought the hide men into direct collision with the people whose world they were destroying. The Comanche and their allies had watched the herds dwindle and understood with perfect clarity what it meant. The hunters were not just killing animals. They were killing the future of every plains family, every band, every nation that lived by the bison. The intrusion into the Texas Panhandle, into hunting grounds the tribes regarded as their own, was the final provocation. Something was going to break. Let that sink in. The rifle that had been carried into Kansas disguised as scripture, that had armed the marksmen who held Little Round Top, was now the instrument emptying a continent of its greatest creature and breaking the people who lived by it. The Sharps had been an instrument of one moral cause in 1856. 2 decades later, it was the central tool of a catastrophe that no one would later be able to call moral at all. The same precision, the same reach, the same single deadly shot turned now against the living foundation of an entire civilization. In the spring of 1874, a band of buffalo hunters pushed south from Dodge City into the Texas Panhandle, into the heart of contested country, and established a small trading and hunting outpost near the ruins of an old Adobe trading post on the South Canadian River. They came to be near the last of the great southern herd. They built a cluster of sod and adobe buildings, a couple of stores, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, a base from which to work the surrounding range. By late spring, some 200 to 300 hunters were operating out of the area, and trade was booming. They were deep in land the Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne regarded as theirs, killing the animals those nations depended on to live. The place was called Adobe Walls, and the people of the plains had decided that the killing would stop there. The reckoning at Adobe Walls came in the gray light before dawn on June 27, 1874. The hunters and traders at the outpost, perhaps 28 men and 1 woman, were sleeping in the scattered buildings when the attack began. A great force of warriors had gathered, drawn from the Comanche, the Kiowa, and the Cheyenne, numbering by various accounts somewhere between 700 and 1,200 mounted men. They were led by the Comanche war chief Quanah Parker and inspired by a young medicine man named Isatai, who had prophesied a great victory, who had promised the warriors that his medicine would protect them from the hunters' bullets, and that they would sweep the white men from the plains. The warriors charged at first light, expecting to catch the camp asleep and overrun it in a single rush. By a stroke of fortune, some of the men had been awakened in the night by a cracking ridgepole in the largest building and were already up and moving when the assault came. The hunters scrambled for their rifles and barricaded themselves inside the thick-walled sod and adobe structures. And then the defenders brought to bear the very weapons that had emptied the plains. These were professional buffalo hunters. Their rifles were the heavy long-range sharps and similar guns, and their trade was hitting a target at distances most men could barely see. What followed was a brutal inversion of everything those rifles had been doing for years. The warriors, armed largely with bows, lances, and shorter-range firearms, had to close the distance to strike. To kill the hunters, they had to come within reach of the buffalo guns, and the buffalo guns reached very far indeed. The hunters fired from loopholes and windows with the same deliberate precision they used on the stand, and the heavy bullets struck down men and horses at ranges the attackers could not answer. The medicine that was supposed to stop the bullets stopped nothing. Wave after wave broke against the adobe walls and fell back, leaving dead and wounded scattered across the open ground. The first furious assault failed. The attackers drew off, and the battle settled into a siege, the warriors keeping the outposts surrounded, the hunters holding their fortified buildings, neither side able to finish it. Several of the defenders had died in the first attack. Many more warriors had fallen, cut down by the long rifles before they could close. The siege stretched into a second day, then a third, the hunters watching from their loopholes, the warriors keeping their distance now, having learned at bitter cost what those rifles could do. It was on the third day that the battle produced the moment that passed into legend. A group of warriors appeared on a distant bluff far across the valley, sitting their horses at a range that seemed utterly beyond any rifle. One of the hunters, a young man of 23 named Billy Dixon, already renowned among his peers as a superb marksman, took up a borrowed heavy sharps, one of the big 50 caliber guns. According to the story that came down afterward, the men urged him to try a shot at the distant figures, almost as a lark, certain the range was impossible. Dixon raised the rifle, judged the enormous arc the bullet would have to travel, aimed high into the empty air, and fired. A long moment passed. The bullet crossed the valley in a great curving flight. And then, far away on the bluff, one of the mounted warriors toppled from his horse. The remaining warriors, seeing a man struck dead at a distance they had believed safe, withdrew from the bluff. Soon after, the siege itself broke up, the great war party dispersing. Dixon's shot became one of the most celebrated feats of marksmanship in the history of the American West. Here's the thing about that famous shot. The legend has grown smooth and certain over the years, and the truth beneath it is more tangled. Army surveyors later measured the distance from Dixon's position to the bluff at 1,538 yards, nearly 9/10 of a mile. And that measurement is real. But whether the shot truly killed the man, whether it was even Dixon's bullet that knocked the warrior down, and how much it really decided the warrior's withdrawal, are questions the legend smooths over. Dixon himself, with a modesty that does him credit, never claimed it as a feat of skill. He called it a scratch shot, a lucky one. The legend made it the shot that ended the battle. The man who fired it only said that he aimed and pulled the trigger, and a man fell. Whatever the precise truth, the meaning was unmistakable. The buffalo hunters, besieged by a force 40 times their number, had been saved by the reach of their rifles, the very guns that were destroying the bison, and with the bison, the foundation of the Plains tribes' world, had now broken the greatest attempt those tribes made to stop the destruction. Let that sink in. The sharps had emptied the prairies of the animal, and when the people of the prairies rose to defend what remained, the same rifle turned them back at nearly a mile. The Battle of Adobe Walls settled nothing for the warriors and everything for the hunters. The campaign that followed, the Red River War, would drive the Southern Plains tribes onto the reservations within a year, and the last of the great Southern herd would be gone soon after. The West was not being opened in any gentle sense of that word. It was being emptied of its animals and of the people who had lived among them, and the Sharps rifle was present at the center of both. The phrase about opening the West has always carried a comfortable sound. The reality on the ground was harder and colder than the phrase allows, and in the very years that the Sharps reached this terrible zenith of its fame, when its name stood for the finest long-range rifle in the world, the seeds of its undoing were already taking root far to the east, in the workshops and laboratories where other men were perfecting the things that would make the great single-shot buffalo gun, for all its glory, obsolete. The thing that killed the Sharps was not a better single-shot rifle. It was a different idea about what a rifle should be. Through the 1870s and into the 1880s, the lever-action repeater matured from the underpowered curiosity of the Civil War into a serious weapon. The Winchester rifles, fed from a magazine, let a man fire many rounds in the time a Sharps shooter fired one and reloaded. For most uses, the hunter, the rancher, the soldier, the trade-off shifted. A man would give up some of the Sharp's tremendous reach and power in exchange for the ability to put a great deal of lead downrange in a hurry. Volume had finally caught up to precision, and then it passed it. Then came the second blow. In the 1880s, smokeless powder began to replace the black powder that the Sharps and its cartridges had been built around. The new propellant burned cleaner, drove smaller bullets at far higher velocities, and made possible a new generation of rifles that were flatter shooting, longer ranged, and lighter than the great black powder buffalo guns. The Sharps had been the supreme expression of one technology. That technology was now becoming the past. The heavy single-shot falling block, the rifle that threw an enormous lead slug behind a charge of black powder, was a magnificent answer to a question the world had stopped asking. And the world had stopped asking for another reason too. The buffalo were gone. The very efficiency with which the Sharps had helped destroy the herds had destroyed the market that bought the rifle. By the early 1880s, there were almost no bison left to hunt on the southern plains, and the great hide trade that had sustained so many hunters and sold so many rifles simply evaporated. The Sharps Rifle Company had built its golden years on a resource that its own product had helped to exterminate. When the animal vanished, so did the reason to buy the gun. The company could not adapt fast enough. The reorganized Sharps Rifle Company, which had moved its operations to Bridgeport, Connecticut, found itself making a superb product for a market that was shrinking on every side at once. Repeaters took the general trade. Smokeless powder rendered the old chamberings obsolete. The buffalo economy collapsed. The firm tried new models and military designs, but it could not find a customer base large enough to sustain it. In 1881, the Sharps Rifle Company closed its doors and went out of business. Here's the bitter kicker. It failed at the very moment the American West was booming, undone by the consequences of its own success and outrun by technologies it could not match. Christian Sharps was not there to see any of it. The inventor who had patented the falling block breech in 1848, who had walked away from his own company by 1853, had died years before, never having grown rich from the weapon that carried his name across a continent. Richard Lawrence, de Richerman, the master armorer who had turned the design into a manufacturable reality, was gone as well. The men who created the rifle did not live to witness either its greatest fame on the plains or its quiet death in Bridgeport. The Sharps had always been, in a sense, an orphan, famous everywhere and owned by no one who had fathered it. But to measure the Sharps only by the closing of its factory is to miss what the rifle had been at its height. For 3 decades, it had been simply the best at what it did. No other rifle of its era could reach as far with as much certainty. The marksmen who carried it spoke of it with a reverence usually reserved for living things. On the long-range target ranges of the period, at places like Creedmoor, Sharp's rifles and their kind set the standard for precision shooting, putting bullet after bullet into distant targets in a demonstration of accuracy that drew crowds and made champions. The rifle that armed the hide hunter was also the rifle of the careful target shooter, the patient expert who valued nothing so much as the certainty of the single well-placed shot. That reputation gave the Sharps a second life that outlasted the company entirely. The name Old Reliable never died. Among collectors, among shooters, among everyone who loved the lore of the American frontier, the Sharps became one of the most cherished rifles ever made. Frontiersmen and statesmen had praised it in its day. Men like John Fremont and Buffalo Bill Cody and Theodore Roosevelt. And that aura of frontier authenticity only deepened as the era it belonged to receded into memory. The rifle that had been a working tool became an icon, a thing held in the hands and remembered. Its legend was carried into the next century by story and image. The heavy octagonal barrel resting across a forked stick, the lone hunter on the empty plains. Generations later, the Sharps would be lovingly reproduced by modern makers, sought after by shooters who wanted to feel the same deliberate weight and fire, the same massive black powder cartridges that the Buffalo men had fired. A weapon that ceased commercial production in 1881 lived on, manufactured again by those who refused to let it disappear. Its design honored more than a century after its maker walked away from it. Few products of the 19th century have been so completely outlived by their own myth, and yet the myth cannot be separated from what the rifle actually did. The glory of the Sharps and the devastation it enabled are the same story told from two sides. It was a triumph of American engineering, the gun that proved the breech loader and set the standard for long-range accuracy. It was also the instrument that emptied the southern plains of the bison and helped break the people who lived by them. To remember the one without the other is to remember only half. The Sharps was magnificent, and what it was used to do was, in large part, a catastrophe. Both things are true, and the truest memory of the rifle holds them together. Stand again on the high plains of the Texas Panhandle, where the grass still moves in the wind and the herds are gone. Somewhere out across that emptiness, a young man once aimed a borrowed Sharps at a figure nearly a mile away and let the great bullet fly. The factory that made the rifle is long closed, its founder long dead, the animal it was built to kill nearly erased and only slowly returning. What remains is the name stamped on the barrels, Old Reliable, and the memory of a weapon that did exactly what it was made to do, with a precision that opened a country and emptied it in the same motion. The plains keep their silence, the rifle keeps its legend, and the wind moves over the grass where the millions once grazed,